During a candid sit-down with Hoda Kotb, Savannah Guthrie dropped a revelation that should have sparked a week of aggressive interrogation. She stated her belief that exactly 2 ransom demands were authentic, not a whole set, just 2. This marks the first instance where someone from the inner circle has provided such a precise, calculated figure. By distinguishing between truth and fiction, she implied that she and her advisors possess information the rest of us lack. She understands the specific anomalies that set those 2 notes apart from the noise. She is aware of the forensic details that align with the crime scene, yet the critical question went unasked. Which 2? No one pressed for the distinction. This morning, Savannah stepped back into Studio 1A, ending a 2-month absence. Dressed in bright yellow with symbolic ribbons nearby, she was met by Craig Melvin, who reached out to steady her hand. From the weather station, Al Roker signaled his affection. She told the cameras it felt like home before calling for the news. The broadcast shifted to international conflicts and rising fuel costs. Nancy's name was never whispered. It was a display of quiet strength from a woman carrying a psychological burden few could ever comprehend. Her resilience is beyond reproach, but beneath the surface, the cold data suggests a far darker reality. Day 66. No suspects, no arrests, no confirmed motive. The Bureau has retreated from Tucson as the leads have turned cold. The investigator leading this complex case had zero experience managing a homicide before this file landed on his desk. The local sheriff, who was quick to exonerate the family, now faces a formal hearing because superiors believe his testimony requires the threat of perjury to be deemed at all reliable. Meanwhile, the ransom narrative that served as the case's foundation is slowly fracturing under its own internal inconsistencies. We have identified 5 specific reasons, all sourced and verified, that challenge the official story. These points suggest the investigation is circling a fixed point. This was no random abduction by a passing ghost. This was an act by someone familiar, someone with a key, an insider. Join us as we examine the evidence. We start with the timeline. At 5:32 p.m., on January 31st, Nancy hailed a ride from her residence. The vehicle arrived to take her to Annie and Tommaso's for an evening of social interaction and dinner. Afterward, the driver cooperated fully, providing a transparent account of the encounter to the authorities. Every second of dashcam footage was analyzed. Investigators found a woman who appeared perfectly at ease. It was a standard, uneventful journey to her daughter's house, except for one crucial discrepancy. It was a one-way trip. Nancy used the app to get there, but she never requested a return. It was Tommaso who drove her back. He dictated the time they left, the path they took, and the exact moment she reached her door, or so he says. His claim of the garage door closing behind her is the only account of that moment that exists. No lens caught the moment. No neighbor bore witness. There is zero independent proof that the drop-off happened as described. Consider the implications of this break in the chain of verifiable information. The initial driver's logs prove Nancy left at 5:32 and arrived at the destination. The digital footprint is undeniable. There are hard timestamps for that arrival, but the return journey, managed by Tommaso, leaves no such trail. No rideshare logs, no dashcam recordings, no third-party global positioning system data to verify his movements. The assertion that Nancy was home by 9:50 p.m. rests entirely on the testimony of the driver. If she truly arrived then, the kidnapping occurred in the gap before her pacemaker went offline at 2:28 a.m. That creates a window of 4.5 hours. But if that arrival time is fabricated or slightly altered, or if an undisclosed event transpired during that private drive, the entire framework of the investigation shifts, and Tommaso is the only person who can confirm the truth. Tommaso maintains he returned her at roughly 9:50 p.m. Her cardiac medication was scheduled for 10. Following her clockwork routine, she would have medicated, removed her hearing aids, and been asleep by 11. Once those aids were removed, the house became a tomb of silence. She would never hear the intrusion. She was effectively locked within her own sensory deprivation, oblivious to the predator entering her space. The security lens finally caught a glimpse of a masked figure at 1:47 a.m. By 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker's link was severed. This left a 41-minute window for the operation to unfold. Nancy was lifted from her bed and moved through the shadows of her own home, never to return. At precisely 2:28, the tether between her and the digital world snapped, as the Bluetooth signal faded into an eerie, absolute silence. For nearly 10 hours following that cutoff, until roughly midday on February 1st, not a single soul from Nancy's inner circle reached out. There were no outgoing pings, no digital check-ins, and no short 4-mile drive to the residence where she lived, just minutes from her sleeping kin. Relatives later justified this lapse by claiming she was supposed to attend a virtual Sunday morning service at a companion's home. Her absence there triggered the first alarm. The friend contacted Annie, who then notified the authorities, finally setting the clock of discovery into motion. A chilling question lingers. If you leave an 84-year-old mother-in-law alone at 9:50 in the evening, a vulnerable woman who is profoundly deaf and dependent on medicine, wouldn't you verify her safety by 10:15 with a quick text? Would you not offer a simple morning greeting? For most families caring for an isolated senior, these welfare checks are an unspoken, automatic reflex. This isn't about rigid procedure. It's the fundamental expression of concern distilled into a brief, 20-second phone conversation. That single act would have shrunk the discovery window from 14 hours to mere minutes. A solitary call at 10:15 p.m. Nancy fails to respond because her aides are removed. Another attempt at 10:30 yields silence. By 10:45, true concern should be mounting. By 11, you're in your car. By 11:15, you're on that porch, seeing the blood and dialing 911. The whole chronological sequence simply implodes. The 14-hour gap evaporates, compressing the mystery of the night into a tiny window. Yet, that crucial, life-saving call never occurred. Silence isn't proof of guilt, but it represents a total abandonment of the care one expects for a vulnerable, elderly woman living alone. This lack of action provided the perfect, uninterrupted window for whoever took Nancy to operate with chilling efficiency and zero detection. Savannah remained in New York then. She began contacting medical facilities once the disappearance was known, but investigators flagged a specific discrepancy in her actions. Savannah's inquiries to the hospitals only began after Annie and Tommaso had already concluded their own calls to those same locations. If local relatives just 4 miles away had already cleared the hospitals, why was Savannah repeating the task from a different state? It suggests a lack of trust in their thoroughness. Now, consider the second point, the ransom note as a calculated diversion. Strip those demands away for a moment. What remains? An 84-year-old woman vanished from her bed, dressed only in her nightwear. She has no shoes, no phone, and her cash-filled handbag remains. Even her heart medicine was left behind. Nothing was stolen, no struggle occurred. Blood was found only at the exit. The body was efficiently removed. There was evidence of prior surveillance and neutralized security cameras. Access was gained through doors held open by familiar household items. Without those ransom notes, the crime transforms into a cold, targeted elimination. This was a removal executed by someone intimate with the property and the victim's vulnerabilities, with no intention of keeping her alive. The medication left on the counter is the smoking gun. If the goal were a profitable kidnapping, that medicine is vital. It would take 5 seconds to grab. They ignored it, and the contents of the suspect's backpack further reinforced this grim conclusion. The Ozark Trail pack seen on the suspect appeared full, yet the weight was distributed with a light, even balance. When the figure leaned forward to obscure the lens of the security camera with a container, the bag remained stable, failing to shift or pull him off balance as a heavy, weighted load would have. The contents were not tools or restraints typical of a kidnapping. They didn't carry the weight of equipment meant for a living captive. Its dimensions suggested something soft and pliable, like folded fabric or a shroud. Living captives require restraints. Bodies require a wrap. The physical behavior of that bag reveals exactly what kind of operation was being carried out that night. The medicine remained. The backpack mirrored the shape of a tarp. The purse was never moved. Her phone sat on the nightstand. Only Nancy was taken, and she was taken by an individual who hadn't prepared for a hostage. They prepared for a body removal. Now, reintroduce the ransom notes. What purpose do they serve? They construct a false narrative, steering the investigation toward a fictitious stranger with a financial motive from outside Nancy's immediate circle. These notes act as a psychological smokescreen, pulling focus away from the home and the last individuals seen inside its walls. Savannah claimed that 2 of these communications were actually legitimate. Those specific notes contained intimate details of the crime scene that had never been disclosed to the general public. They detailed the exact placement of interior items and damage to exterior fixtures, granular, verifiable data embedded within a ransom demand. The author of those words was either inside that house the night she vanished or spoke directly to the person who was. One does not simply guess the exact arrangement of personal belongings inside a home they have never actually entered. Among the recovered documents, one particular message bore a striking resemblance to a formal apology. The author expressed a strange remorse, claiming they hadn't realized the fragility of Nancy's heart or the true severity of her medical condition. In the documented history of professional abductions, there is absolutely no precedent for a kidnapper sending a letter of regret to the victim's kin. Such an event simply does not occur in reality. The psychological makeup of a criminal who takes an elderly woman at gunpoint does not include a need for written penance. That specific correspondence was never the work of a captor. It was meticulously crafted for a very specific audience, someone who desperately wanted Savannah and her siblings to believe their mother's passing was a tragic mishap rather than a cold-blooded, premeditated act. If the family buys into the accident narrative, the authorities keep their eyes fixed on mysterious outsiders. To reject that story is to turn the investigation inward. Yet the February 11th communication introduced a whole new element. This sender portrayed themselves as an informed observer rather than a participant, claiming to possess inside knowledge of the crime. They demanded a payment of exactly 1 Bitcoin in exchange for naming the individual responsible. Curiously, they sought contact specifically with Annie and Cameron in Arizona, completely bypassing Savannah's massive public reach. If you are selling high-stakes information, logic dictates you approach the person with the deepest pockets and the loudest voice. That person is undeniably Savannah. You don't target the siblings living near the scene unless you believe the culprit is also lurking within that same geographic circle. A reward of $1,200,000 has been active for weeks, funded by the FBI and private donors. Yet, no one has come forward. In typical stranger abduction cases, a bounty of this magnitude almost always flushes out a witness. Someone in the killer's orbit who overheard a slip of the tongue or witnessed a strange movement. A neighbor or a coworker always notices a shift in behavior because $1,200,000 is life-altering wealth. When the silence is this absolute, it suggests that those with knowledge are the same people who would be destroyed by sharing it. This lack of tips isn't a failure of the system, it is a definitive piece of evidence. The ransom notes weren't the engine of this crime, they were merely the window dressing. They provided a convenient shape that pointed away from Nancy's inner circle toward a digital ghost who asked for millions and then vanished. That isn't how a real kidnapping functions. It is how a staged scene is built. And once you strip away the theater, what remains is a targeted, intimate act committed by someone who understood the layout of the house. They knew the schedule, the physical weaknesses, and they never intended for Nancy Guthrie to survive a fact confirmed by her remains. The victim's body was intentionally moved away from the primary scene. In cases where an insider is responsible, removing the body from the home is one of the most consistent behavioral patterns. This isn't done to hide the crime itself, but to fundamentally redirect the trajectory of the ensuing police investigation. A body found inside the home points directly at those with keys. A missing person creates a vacuum of ambiguity. It allows the stranger abduction myth to breathe, buying the perpetrators the one thing they need most: time. Time to draft fake letters, and time to breathe life into a fictional villain. While the police hunt for a ghost, the actual killers remain safe within that 4-mile radius between the two family homes, waiting for the heat to die down. Consider, too, who introduced the entire ransom framework to this investigation. The moment Annie reached Savannah with the initial news, Savannah contacted her brother Cameron, a man with a background in military intelligence. According to her, his assessment was instantaneous. Without examining the scene or seeing a single note, his conclusion was reached in seconds. He insisted Nancy had been taken for ransom, claiming Savannah's celebrity status was the sole motivation for the crime. He jumped to the most elaborate explanation possible: a planned, high-profile kidnapping before any other possibilities were even explored. That specific narrative became the family's operating truth from that second forward. The person who installed that lens did so before the first responders had even secured the front porch. The ransom theory wasn't a conclusion drawn from the evidence. It was a script handed to the family before the evidence was even gathered. 66 days later, when you remove that script and look at the medication, the notes, and the unclaimed reward, it becomes clear that the ransom theory was never actually a theory. This is merely a diversion, a smokescreen hiding a truth lurking just 4 miles distant. Point 3. The Syndicate. Three Tucson locals find their identities constantly entwining within the threads of this inquiry. Their ties appeared in fragmented reports, yet no one synthesized the data. Tomaso Chion is married to Nancy Guthrie. For over 20 years, he has called the Tucson desert his permanent home. He handles bass for Early Black, an ensemble ingrained in the regional music landscape for nearly 19 years. He stands as the final witness to Nancy's presence on January 31st. He claims he delivered her home, escorting her inside before the garage sealed shut. Such is his testimony. No lens captured the arrival, and no neutral observer exists to validate his claim. For nearly 2 decades, Dominic Evans has shared the stage with Tomaso in that identical musical outfit. They shared venues, practices, and backstage spaces. Evans's rap sheet lists burglary, robbery, larceny, and financial fraud. It reflects a life spent infiltrating forbidden spaces and seizing property that was never his to take. His physical stature aligns precisely with the federal descriptions of the figure caught by the doorbell camera. His residence sits mere minutes from Nancy's quiet street. Analyze the nature of Evans's past offenses. Infiltration is rarely an act of sudden whim. It demands expertise in entry, navigating interiors silently, and bypassing those sleeping within the walls. It requires a clean escape. Robbery, however, necessitates direct confrontation and a readiness to employ violent coercion. Financial crimes like embezzlement rely on meticulous strategy and long-term manipulation. This isn't the profile of a clumsy amateur. It is the dossier of a calculating professional. Pair that history with a 19-year partner whose mother-in-law vanished from her residence without a trace. Given the lack of physical struggle, the overlap between these two men is impossible to ignore. Federal bulletins detailed a suspect, 5'10" average frame, with dark facial hair visible under a mask. He bore a mass-market retail backpack and carried a pistol positioned clumsily over his outer garments. Formal confirmation remains publicly undisclosed. Yet the investigators who drafted those specifics know exactly whose shadow they are chasing. If Evans's physique and features have been scientifically weighed against that sketch, the authorities aren't saying. Derek Kayla faced charges for a digital ransom note mentioning cryptocurrency, phrased by someone clearly privy to the kidnapping. Surprisingly, that message never reached Savannah Guthrie's hands in New York City. It bypassed official channels, landing directly on Tomaso Chion's private device, followed by a short voice call. Police eventually dismissed his involvement as a cruel bluff and granted his release. Yet a glaring mystery lingers. How did Kayla obtain Chion's unlisted personal contact information? Kayla inhabits the same Tucson sonic landscape, haunting the same clubs and social rings as the others. A cohesive theory emerges. This job, requiring 3 weeks of reconnaissance, was not the work of one man. Disabling security, prepping exits, and extracting a victim silently from a stronghold requires 2 specialized functions. One mind to conceptualize, one hand to act. The mastermind and the field agent. The visionary understands the floor plan, the daily routine, and the precise timing of prescriptions. He knows when silence falls and when the house is most vulnerable. Meanwhile, the technician masters the breach. He navigates shadows effortlessly, removing a human weight through the main exit without spilling a single drop. These talents rarely belong to the same individual. When these capabilities are plotted, they form a triangle centered squarely within a specific Tucson musical subculture. 3 suspects, 1 scene, 1 shared contact, and 1 void. The final companion is tied to a thief. Furthermore, a 3rd associate from that circle beamed a ransom note straight to the first man's device. This isn't a series of unfortunate accidents. This is an organized web. 4th point, the residence. Insiders from the investigation characterized the interior of the victim's house with one chilling word: pristine. Nothing was disturbed, no struggle occurred, no objects were moved, and every single lock remained intact. The scene suggested that Nancy had merely stood up and walked away of her own free will. Only faint bloodstains at the entrance and back doors propped open with household items betrayed the crime. The objects in question were Nancy's personal ceramic planters, massive, heavy vessels staged precisely at 3 different entry points. These guardians of the threshold were found at the kitchen's rear door, the glass sliders on the patio, and the side gate near the garage. Someone moved them under the cloak of night around 2 in the morning, navigating with a chilling confidence that left no room for hesitation. Not a single item was disturbed on a terrace they supposedly had never seen. This level of familiarity is not the mark of a stranger. It points toward a shadow who had handled those pots before someone intimately acquainted with their weight and their strategic placement. The primary entrance was shielded by a heavy-duty reinforced steel security screen, a barrier that witnesses claim is essentially impossible to penetrate from the outside once the deadbolts are thrown. Based on the chilling biological evidence left at the door, retired investigator O'Connell determined that 2 individuals likely carried her out. The figure on the porch didn't need to force their way through that steel cage. They simply waited. The lock was turned from the inside, suggesting an accomplice was already lurking within the home. Then there is the blackout. Every single wireless surveillance feed on the estate went dead the moment she was taken. The pool, the rear gardens, and the side alley cameras were silenced, while the doorbell lens was manually obstructed. A physical cover blinded the doorbell, but the other eyes were shut remotely neutralized, without the intruder ever touching them. This implies the perpetrator arrived with a specialized electronic disruptor, a signal jammer tuned perfectly to drown out the local Wi-Fi frequencies. You don't pick up such sophisticated hardware on a whim. This was a calculated acquisition, sourced long before the crime. It required testing and an intimate knowledge of the network's technical specs, the exact brand and model of the security hardware. That is, intelligence gathered through deliberate scouting on the property itself, from standing close enough to the devices to record their serial numbers and operational details, a level of reconnaissance that goes far beyond a simple drive-by or a glance from the street corner. A neighbor residing 4 houses away, Jeff Lambie, noted that 2 of his own security units failed during that exact window of time. He couldn't confirm if it was mere chance or something more sinister, but a high-powered signal disruptor would have projected a zone of silence that bled into the surrounding yards. The failure of those nearby cameras might be the only digital footprint left by the device that blinded Nancy's home. We must also consider what the state of the house tells us. It screams that robbery was never the motive. Nothing of value was missing. Her cash-filled purse and phone sat untouched, debunking any theory of a random home invasion that turned violent. A common thief doesn't spend weeks conducting surveillance or arrive with high-tech gear to bypass a wireless security grid. This evidence effectively erases any possibility of a crime driven by financial gain or material theft. Had money been the objective, the scene would be one of chaos, upturned drawers, ransacked closets, and the mess of a frantic search. Instead, there was a haunting stillness. The random burglary hypothesis crumbles when faced with such eerie order. Imagine a frantic intruder coming face to face with an 84-year-old woman who could barely navigate her own driveway. A frail victim in her pajamas, weighing less than 150 pounds, would not leave behind an immaculate house. There would be panic and broken furniture. We would see shattered glass and the debris of a struggle between an aggressive predator and a victim too weak to fight back. But the scene inside Nancy's home was surgical, methodical, clinical, and completely undisturbed. This isn't the fallout of a botched plan. It is the execution of a dark ritual that had been rehearsed to perfection. There is another detail, a quiet one, that has been almost entirely ignored by the public eye. Nancy once shared her home with a dog, but the animal had passed away long before the abduction took place. Security experts argue that even a small canine presence would have likely compromised the entire clandestine operation. A single bark at 1 a.m. would have alerted neighbors like Lambie, whose own pets had woken him on previous nights. Whoever orchestrated this knew the dog was gone. They knew the house was silent. That isn't a detail you find out from the sidewalk. That is the kind of intimate knowledge held by someone inside her life. This brings us to Factor 5, her extreme vulnerability. At 84, Nancy relied on a pacemaker and daily heart medication that the sheriff warned was fatal to miss for even 24 hours. She wore powerful hearing aids, and in their absence, she lived in a world of near-total sensory deprivation and silence. Her movement was painfully limited. Authorities noted she struggled just to reach the edge of her own property. Bereft of her dog and living in isolation, she was a solitary figure in a massive residence within the Catalina foothills. In that secluded neighborhood, the homes are islands, spaced so far apart that a scream in one house is easily swallowed by the desert night. No resident caregiver was stationed there. No medical staff visited. No emergency pendants were worn, and the unmonitored security system lacked any active recording or overnight surveillance. Consider an 84-year-old woman battling cardiac issues, complete deafness, and significantly restricted mobility. Without her hearing aids at night, she was utterly cut off, a fragile soul left entirely defenseless in the dark. One glaring question remains unasked by the press. Why was Nancy permitted to live in such a precarious state? Who decided an 84-year-old with those specific physical frailties should reside alone in such a massive, secluded property without any support? We must also ask who gained from this arrangement, because such extreme vulnerability is rarely a neutral coincidence. Being defenseless is a condition that a family either proactively resolves or quietly allows to persist. Nancy's children were fully aware of her profound deafness and her strict medication requirements. They knew the dog was gone and that the cameras were merely decorative pieces without a paid subscription. They understood the suffocating silence of that neighborhood after midnight. Following dinner on January 31st, Tommaso simply watched the garage door close. A chilling silence followed, lasting 14 hours before anyone attempted to contact her. When a parent is that fragile, unable to even hear an intruder break in concern, usually manifests as action. For a mother who cannot run and requires daily pills, you don't just hope for the best. You install a life alert. You establish nightly check-ins, hire a part-time aide, or at least activate the security feed for remote monitoring. You take precautions. In a family wealthy enough to afford every safety net, the absence of these measures feels like a choice. It represents a dangerous environment that someone deliberately allowed to remain unchanged. Think of the many emergencies that could strike a woman in Nancy's condition during any given night. A fall, a cardiac episode, or a power failure severing her pacemaker's connection, each would require an immediate, life-saving response. In every one of those scenarios, Nancy was rendered helpless the moment she set her hearing aids aside. She would never hear a ringing phone or a frantic neighbor pounding on her front door. She would simply lie wherever she collapsed until a physical visitor eventually discovered her body. Her solitary safety net was a single friend expecting her for church, one person, one scheduled visit, once a week. That was the sum total of protection for an 84-year-old woman of her status. This isn't about intentional harm. It is about acknowledging that the vulnerability was undeniable. The family recognized the danger, and whoever orchestrated Nancy's disappearance was certainly banking on it. The hearing aids were out, the medicine sat untouched, the cameras were blind, and the house was a tomb of silence. 14 hours passed before her absence was even noted. That isn't a series of accidents, it is a tactical roadmap. The architect of that checklist understood Nancy's private life well enough to exploit every single weakness on it. 66 days have passed. The task force is still active, but federal resources have begun pulling back from field operations. Experts are currently analyzing a complex DNA mixture recovered from the property. Forensic specialists have described the sample as potentially unsolvable. Meanwhile, the sheriff faces a legal hearing later this week. A veteran prosecutor has called the probe a disaster, suggesting the suspect is likely a known entity in the local system. And as the sun rose this morning, Nancy Guthrie anchored the national news in a yellow dress, while her mother's disappearance yielded no leads, no suspects, and no clarity. Beneath the surface, two details linger. Nancy Guthrie's blue Honda CR-V was impounded by investigators for over 40 days. The vehicle underwent an exhaustive forensic scrub-down at a specialized facility before it was finally returned to the family. 40 days is an irregular timeline for processing a vehicle belonging to someone who has been cleared. That is the time frame of a team hunting for something microscopic and specific. They were searching for fibers or biological evidence inside the car driven on the night Nancy vanished. The CR-V is back, but the results of that forensic search have been kept strictly confidential. Meanwhile, social media images have surfaced showing unidentified people at Nancy's house loading belongings into cars. Annie's car was visible in those photos as boxes were hauled away. Yet, Nancy Guthrie hasn't been legally declared dead. No death certificate exists in the official records. No probate has begun. Yet personal property is being stripped from the home of a woman who remains missing. These 5 points are far more than mere speculation. They represent cold, recurring patterns distilled from verified reports, official statements, and the weight of physical evidence. We are looking at a timeline curated by the family, a 14-hour void of silence that remains entirely unaccounted for. The kidnapping narrative quickly disintegrates the moment you weigh it against the vital medication left abandoned and untouched on a kitchen counter. A web of associations is tightly coiled around the final person known to have seen Nancy while she was still breathing. The crime scene reveals an intruder who was no stranger, exploiting specific vulnerabilities that only someone deeply familiar with Nancy's life could have targeted. I must address a specific counterpoint. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Jennifer Coffindaffer recently outlined 10 reasons why she questions the theory of family involvement. She posited that if Annie or Tommaso had truly intended to cause Nancy harm, they could have easily interfered with her prescriptions or used a pillow, rather than orchestrating a complex, staged abduction. Her argument suggests the family lacked a financial motive, noting Savannah's apparent pride in Nancy's regular appearances on the Today Show. She questioned why the family would perform 3 separate site surveys in January for a home they had lived in since childhood. These points are worth considering, yet they rest upon a fundamental assumption that I find deeply problematic. Coffindaffer assumes that family involvement necessitates that they personally carried out the physical act of violence. The facts suggest otherwise, a calculated operation designed by an intimate insider, but executed by a different hand. The architect versus the operative. While Annie and Tommaso had no need to scout their own home, a hired hand or a directed associate, perhaps someone with a criminal history of burglary, certainly would. Savannah may not have been desperate for cash, but someone within that Tucson social circle likely was. The choice to stage a kidnapping over poisoning is simple. Forensic investigators look for tampered medication before anything else. A theatrical abduction casts suspicion outward toward ghosts and strangers, whereas tainted pills point a finger directly at the caregivers. This elaborate staging isn't proof of innocence. It is the primary reason this investigation has been stalled for 66 days. Coffindaffer also highlighted the fact that local law enforcement has officially cleared the family members. However, the man behind that clearance, Sheriff Chris Nanos, faces an oath hearing this week regarding his professional conduct and his handling of this case. This is the same official who publicly denied the existence of physical evidence that federal agents later confirmed was seized from the scene. He handed the crime scene back to the family prematurely and bypassed the Bureau's labs to send forensic evidence to a private facility in Florida. The situation became so dire that the local county government took the unprecedented step of a unanimous vote to force his testimony under oath, as his public statements had lost all credibility. An official clearance carries only as much weight as the integrity of the person who signs it. And the signature on this document belongs to a man whose honesty is being scrutinized under the threat of perjury this very week. Each of these 5 recurring patterns leads to a singular conclusion. The threat didn't come from outside, it came from within. Someone in Tucson knows exactly what transpired in that house, and the evidence suggests they aren't the mysterious stranger the world is hunting for. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Leave a comment below and share which of these 5 patterns you find most haunting. In our next chapter, we follow the money, and the paper trail is